evening I'm going to talk about John Farquhar Fulton, a major contributor to the field of psychology in affective neuroscience. Fulton was born in 1899 in St. Paul, Minnesota. His father was one of the founders of the University of Minnesota Medical School. He studied at the University of Minnesota after serving on World War I, and then transferred to Harvard University, graduating with honors in 1921. While at Harvard, he would study zoology under Edward Lorenz Mark. In 1923, Fulton received a Rhodes Scholarship to study at Magdalen College, Oxford. He studied with Sir Charles Sherrington in his physiology laboratory and earned his doctorate of philosophy. His doctoral thesis was entitled Muscular Contraction and Reflex Control of Movement. Following his PhD, Fulton would go on to earn a medical degree from Harvard Medical School in 1927. Here, he had the exciting opportunity to study neurosurgery with Harvey Cushing, a pioneer in the development of this techniques. In 1931, he earned a prestigious John Sterling professorship at Yale University, where he ended up heading the Department of Physiology. Fulton would remain at Yale for the rest of his career. Fulton made many contributions throughout his career. I will begin by discussing his contributions to the history of psychology. Fulton was a strong advocate for training in the history of science and felt that the average scientist should be trained to approach their disciplines from historical perspectives. He collected a large and diverse set of old medical texts and authored texts based on historical research. He would even go on to become president of the History of Science Society at Yale in 1949. Now to discuss Fulton's research. Fulton combined the research skills he developed in his PhD program with his neurosurgical skills that he'd learned with Cushing at medical school. Combining these skills, he was able to carry out effective lesion studies in primates. He would end up establishing the first primate laboratory for the study of brain sciences in the United States. Upon founding his laboratory, a lot of his early work involved applying his neurosurgical skills to mapping specifically the motor cortex in primates. He carried out a lot of this work with his graduate student, Margaret Kennard, who would later go on to have the Kennard Principle named after her. Together, they mapped the motor cortex using lesion methods in primates. They determined the necessity of the premotor cortex for efficient movement through their work together. Fulton became interested like many of his time, in the neural basis of psychiatric illness. The cause of psychiatric illness in Fulton's time was poorly understood, but there was an emerging idea that frontal lobe dysfunction played a major role. This conclusion was based on isolated case reports of patients with specific frontal lobe lesions, such as Phineas Gage. However, at Fulton's time, this theory had not yet been empirically tested. 1870 to 1890 was known as the golden age of cerebral localization, a time when scientists all around the country began mapping the cortex and considering which parts of the brain tissue were responsible for which functions. At the turn of the century, advances in surgical techniques and the use of electrical stimulation were leading to frequent attempts by scientists to map the individual functions of the neocortex. The frontal lobes were theorized to be the seat of personality, and dysfunction of the frontal lobes was therefore thought to be responsible for abnormal personalities and erratic behavior. Like many of his time, Fulton was also interested in the relationship between the frontal lobes and behavior. He decided to perform ablations of the frontal lobes on 2 of his primate subjects to see how their behavior patterns would change. Becky and Lucy were chimpanzees in Fulton's lab, and the first primate subjects to undergo ablation of the frontal lobes. Fulton performed the ablations and then measured the behavioral changes that occurred following ablation of them. He felt that by this, he would be able to infer what purpose the frontal lobe tissue was serving in the primate's behavior. Fulton found that following ablation, the chimps made increased errors on experimental tasks. He also found that their agitation was lowered and they experienced severe behavioral slowing. Based on these findings, Fulton and his lab decided to take on a multi-year project to study frontal lobe function in different types of primates. Fulton and his lab mates trained apes and monkeys to learn to solve particular problems, inhibit certain responses, and perform complex mental tasks. Then, they observed the extent to which the apes and monkeys' skills in these tasks declined following frontal lobe ablation. 4 years post-operation, Fulton found that the sensory motor habits of the primates remained intact following frontal lobe ablation. However, the ablation decreased their reproductive memory, led to muted and calm behavior, caused them to make increased errors on problem-solving tasks, decreased their agitation to previously stressful stimuli. He concluded that the tissue he had ablated in the frontal lobes played a role in regulation of behavior and thinking. Therefore, disordered behavior must originate from the frontal lobes. Fulton took these findings to the Second International Neurological Congress in 1935. This Congress met at the Royal Society of Medicine in London, and the topic of the meeting was frontal lobe function. Therefore, Fulton's talk was well anticipated. Fulton and his student Carlisle Jacobson presented The Functions of the Frontal Lobes, a comparative study in monkeys, chimpanzees, and man at this Congress. While they were sharing their findings, most audience members were extremely excited, given that they had a lot of curiosity about frontal lobe functions. The audience members during Fulton and Carlisle's talk included Ega Moniz, a Portuguese neurologist. It has been suggested that during the discussion period of his presentation, Moniz asked Fulton whether the procedure performed on his primates, Becky and Lucy, could ever be extended to actual treatment of psychiatric illness in human patients. Shortly after this conference and hearing about Fulton's findings, Ega Moniz proceeded with attempts to perform the first frontal lobotomies on human patients suffering from mental illness. He reasoned that if ablation of the frontal lobes in primates reduced agitated behavior and led to them being calmer, the same should happen with human patients whose agitation made them difficult to care for. However, frontal lobotomies, like the ones performed by Moniz, led to devastating consequences for patients, including severe memory loss, inability to speak, and utter loss of ability to live independently. Moniz's first operations were performed in late 1935 and early 1936, and they would quickly go on to influence Walter Freeman, a famous psychiatrist who performed over 2,000 lobotomies, including on famous individuals such as Rosemary Kennedy. Many of his patients were completely incapacitated following the surgeries, yet despite these results, Freeman would continue well into the late 1970s to perform such surgeries. The question begged, therefore, what role did Fulton's research play in this dark period of our history of psychologists? There is extensive debate over the extent to which Fulton's work contributed to the advent of psychosurgery in the mid-20th century. Historian Jack Pressman emphasized that Fulton's work provided confirmation, not inspiration, for Moniz. In his words, Moniz was already considering psychosurgery as a possible mental health treatment, and Fulton's work simply provided him with some scientific confirmation that indeed it would work. Some have even debated about whether or not the supposed discussion between Fulton and Moniz really did take place at the conference. It is telling that Moniz's first report on the results of his first 20 patients did not cite Fulton and Jacobson. As you might have expected them to, had Fulton been the one to give him the idea. What do we know about how Fulton responded to Moniz and Freeman's work in psychosurgery? Well, we do know that in 1936, Fulton lauded Freeman's initial surgery as a huge milestone in mental illness treatment. However, at a conference in 1947, Fulton harshly criticized Freeman's practices. He was not opposed to the basic theories on which frontal lobotomy was based. After all, Fulton had been the one to emphasize the role of the frontal lobes in behavior regulation in primates. However, he believed that psychosurgeries and lobotomies were currently being performed far too soon physiology, hence the devastating side effects going on when Freeman performed his surgeries. There is some evidence that Fulton tried to make things different and change the rapid tide of psychosurgery in America. In 1951, Fulton published a text reviewing the contemporary knowledge and conclusions about affective behavior, emotions, and the frontal lobe. In his text, Fulton did not deny that frontal lobotomy leads to reduction in certain problematic behaviors. However, he called for modifications and changes to the current psychosurgical techniques. He stated that these changes were absolutely necessary if frontal lobotomy was to continue. Fulton did not seem to feel that psychosurgery could go on as it was currently being performed. What were the lasting contributions of Fulton's work? Well, frontal lobes have continued to be an area of interest with regard to affective behavior. The frontal lobe limbic system connections, which were noted by Fulton in his manuscripts, are a major topic of neuropsychology research today. The frontal lobes in these connections are currently being studied across several different affective and behavioral disorders, including autism spectrum disorders, schizophrenia, major depression, executive functions, and cognitive disorders. Fulton also made lasting contributions to primate research. His use of primate research to contribute to our understanding of higher cortical functions in humans was novel for his time, but today, centers for primate research in cognitive affective neuroscience exist all across the nation and the world. Fulton's contributions to our fields overall can be conceptualized as positive. He was a pioneer in the study of the frontal lobe's role in affective behavior.